evolutionary...
Man, I feel good. Could have been a fool to me. Or these stories to get my mind right.
The High Evolutionary wanted Apocalypse to create a world ruled by mutants to keep humanity's population in check. Or hell, maybe the brainwaves of mutants just don't make celestial babies grow. And maybe the reason he was so keen to discover the source of Rocket's creative thinking is because his docile alien races would still need to defend themselves without overpopulation. Or maybe he wanted to create a race so innovative and clever that they would have figured out a way to kill that celestial young and eliminate them from the universe. Maybe the High Evolutionary was like a programmer writing code to perform functions for him. Now, it's important to note that he regarded life forms that he created as his property, as experiments. He destroyed Earth as easily as I destroyed a city in SimCity. But to him, that's all Counter-Earth was, a simulation, a trial and error filled with his creations, who to him are like autonomous computer code. And he viewed Rocket's friends in the same way. I'm not saying
that is so harsh. I can't believe you just said that.
I'm not saying it's right, just that this is his point of view. It is, in fact, heinous and wrong. But if you look at it historically, the God of the Old Testament was extremely brutal, wiping out whole cities with fire, flooding the world, killing millions. And yet, hundreds of millions of Christians and Jews gather to worship that same God every week.
But it's also hypocritical that he talks about bigotry while he is a bigot against imperfect life forms.
But we're a fabulous place were it not for the ignorance and bigotry.
But look, it's not like he goes around the galaxy wiping out imperfect races. He's content to let other planets exist. He just also wants to create his own perfect race. Even if all that stuff I said about the Celestials isn't true, we know that he still wants to create a perfect race. Now, he wants to do this through eugenics and calling what he calls lower life forms. Again, all heinous, very wrong. No. But he didn't want to create like a race of warriors to go out and conquer the galaxy. He wanted to create people that would never destroy themselves with bigotry and hatred, while he himself destroyed those same worlds as punishment for bigotry and hatred. Now, I don't think that we would ever see the High Evolutionary redeemed for his crimes, but I do think that he is a fascinating, nuanced character. The best Marvel villains are the ones who think that they themselves are the heroes, and the High Evolutionary definitely thinks that he's acting in the greater good for the universe, and it would be weird if maybe he was kind of right. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.
Can you dodge my canary cry, Barry?
Guess I'm about to find out.
Thanks for being stupid enough to try.
Begin.
Left out some important information, but good as the Jedi. Hey, welcome back to Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, we've made some pretty great theory videos, broken down the ending, talked about the Easter eggs, but now I want to really get into what this movie really means and what it's trying to say. The movie is filled with big ideas like utopianism, eugenics, religion, genesis, theism, creationism, trauma, and we're going to unpack all of that. But the theme of the movie, the one thing that unites all of these elements is empathy. James Gunn even spelled this out in a tweet, saying, at the end of the day, this is a movie about joy and compassion and learning to see beyond the rim of our own worlds and having empathy for all living things.
But what does empathy even mean?
Well, it means to understand and share the feelings of another. In other words, it's the ability to see the world from someone else's point of view. Empathy is the great argument killer, and it's the crux of the kind of peaceful society that the High Evolutionary is trying to build. The arc of this team over 3 movies has been to overcome trauma and learn to empathize with others. Like when Nebula forced Gamora to understand how her endless quest to win ruined her life.
You were the one who wanted to win, and I just wanted a sister.
Guardians 1 was about the team setting aside their personal desires to work for the good of a collective. Guardians 2 was about the team overcoming their own personal egos to conquer the ego. And Guardians 3 is about the characters finally understanding one another. Oh, and by the way, everyone, before we get too far into this video, I want to show you this very cool Doug as Rocket team. So this film is filled with people. It sure is, and we have lots of sweet teas in our merch store, and shopping with us is the best way you can support our channel. Thanks for being here with us. Check out the link in the description below. So this film is filled with people trying to understand one another. Peter tries to explain to Gamora what they had in another life.
Maybe if you open yourself up to it, there's a possibility.
I don't think so, Gwen.
When the Bowie lands on Counter-Earth, the team struggles to communicate what they want. And Peter has to find a way to communicate with the Batwoman, at first by screaming at her like a tourist, but eventually they communicate through the act of art when Peter draws the man they're looking for. Art is actually a great unifier across societies because it creates something that many cultures can empathize with. For instance, in The Wizard of Oz, pretty much everybody everywhere on the planet can relate to the simple goal of trying to get home. And later in the movie, Nebula struggles to communicate with the children, but Drax immediately knows how to speak to kids, first by dancing like a monkey, but then literally by speaking their language. The character with the greatest arc to learn empathy is Adam Warlock. He begins the movie serving the High Evolutionary because he only wants to save his civilization. He's only concerned for his people, but then he misunderstands his mom's order to show him weaving business, and he sees how his actions have hurt Blurp's feelings. Adam then says, I don't like how this makes me feel, because he is empathizing with the pet, and so he takes him in. Adam eventually becomes a hero because Groot empathizes with him. Groot saves his life, saying everyone deserves a second chance. See, all of the Guardians have been given a second chance to reinvent their lives, but especially Groot because he is the son of a tree that sacrificed himself for the others.
If a graduate degree from Walden, you can make a real difference. Slow fresh.
Groot's empathy for Warlock not only saves Adam, but it eventually saves Peter when Warlock saves his life. The lesson here is that empathy creates a society where people work together for mutual benefit. And later when we talk about the High Evolutionary's perfect society, we'll see that the missing element there was empathy. So, with this central theme of empathy, Mantis has become the most important character in the movie. Her powers have always been really underrated. See, she is an empath who can feel the emotions of others. But this power also helps her to understand everybody's emotions even better than they understand them. Like, she would make a great therapist. For example, look at the Abelisks. The Guardians fought one of these in Volume 2, so we just assume they're big, bloodthirsty monsters. The High Evolutionary also believes they're monsters, so he sicks them on the teeth. But Mantis sees them for who they really are. Scared animals that only want to eat batteries. Mantis is always looking out for others and trying to see past their crusty exteriors.
I was screaming at something scary behind you, not you. Really cool. Girl.
She's the one who sees past Peter's trauma and encourages him to heal. When Peter says that his granddad screamed at him, Nebula tries to empathize with his grandfather, saying that he was probably just trying to protect Peter. But Mantis's great achievement in the movie is probably when she finally gets through to Nebula. Nebula spends the movie, and actually every movie, criticizing others. She screams at Mantis for losing their suits, screams at Drax for being Drax. And the reason Nebula does this is because this is how she was raised. Thanos was hypercritical of her, even replacing the parts of her that displeased him. So Nebula is always trying to find flaws in others because that's how she was raised. But Mantis finally tells her to stop finding fault in everyone. They love Drax because of his flaws and not in spite of them. Drax is dumb, but if he weren't dumb, then he wouldn't make them laugh. This also fits in nicely with the movie's theme of finding beauty in imperfections, which we'll talk about a bit later on. The Guardians have always been united by their trauma. It's the one thing they've always had in common. Trauma creates a need for connection, and in this movie, we see that Rocket's trauma created his first connection with his friends. The very first words that Rocket ever says are hurt, and his pain prompts Lila to lick a cloth and then use it to soothe his wound. So we see that pain creates empathy, which creates friendship, community, and understanding. Peter makes friends with the Batwoman in the same way by using a cloth to a cut on her leg. In fact, a lot of this movie is about people empathizing with Peter and Peter learning to empathize with Gamora. For instance, the whole monologue in the elevator when he says,
And then I lost my temper and nearly destroyed half the universe.
this is Peter giving his side of the story to the audience after he royally screwed the pooch in Infinity War. The internet rioted after that movie, saying everything was Star-Lord's fault, and now we finally get his side of the story. But more importantly, Peter comes to understand this new version of Gamora. Remember, his Gamora was killed by Thanos in Infinity War, and this version is from 2014. The last time they met, this happened. So Peter spends this entire movie idealizing this version of Gamora, trying to force her into being who he imagines her to be. It's a kind of fetishization that is unhealthy and is borderline stalker behavior. Now this is because Peter does not see Gamora for who she is, only who he wants her to be. And in the same way, Gamora lacks any empathy for the group. She only sticks with him to keep her sister safe. In other words, to protect her own family. Much like Adam Warlock was only trying to protect his own family. But after Gamora sees how important Rocket is to everybody, she puts her own life on the line to save his. Now, she starts off the movie by calling Peter Quinn and keeping him at arm's length. But by the end of the movie, she understands what she saw in him when she says, "I bet we were fun." And Peter understands that Gamora is lost to him, and he's finally able to confront his trauma and move past it. Gamora also begins the movie not believing that Groot is actually speaking, kind of like Peter in the first movie.
A scared, pissed-off 3-year-old.
You said that.
But near the end, she understands him without even noticing she's doing it. And then, in one of the final scenes, we, the audience, actually hear Groot say,
I love you guys.
now this isn't because Groot can suddenly speak. Notice how nobody else reacts to this change in vocabulary. It's because in this moment, we, the audience, are able to fully empathize with Groot, so we are able to understand him as well. So the journey of all the heroes is to discover empathy, and they are opposed by the High Evolutionary, who represents the opposite of empathy, which is apathy or maybe even antipathy. Now, apathy means total disinterest in someone else, while antipathy is more like outright dislike of someone else. The High Evolutionary rides this line perfectly. He either outright hates his creations, like Rocket, or he sees no value in their existence, like all the cute Zootopia people on Counter-Earth. Now, this is because the High Evolutionary sees his creations as possessions. To him, they're objects. To underscore this, he only ever calls Rocket by his serial number 89P13. Now, as we pointed out in our Easter egg video, this is very much like the musical Les Mis. A police officer named Javert is obsessed with an escaped convict named Jean Valjean, whose prisoner number is
601.
Now, over the years, Valjean turns his life around, becomes a mayor, starts a factory, raises a family, but even then, Javert cannot empathize with him, still calling him Javert sees Valjean as less than human, as a criminal who is only defined by his number. And for the High Evolutionary, calling Rocket by his serial number is a way to dehumanize him, or depersonize him. I'm not sure what the term would be for a raccoon. As during the Holocaust, Nazis tattooed numbers on Jews' arms, so these human beings could be cataloged and recorded like cattle or possessions. This dehumanized the Nazis' victims by turning them into objects, and the High Evolutionary regards Rocket as a possession. He's even offended when Rocket dares to ask when he can go to the New World. Later, he even screams at him, saying, "How dare you think you were more, 89P13?" And this is part of the movie's emphasis on the power of
Inevitably, extraordinary awaits.
names. Lila convinces all of the animals to give themselves names to express who they are. Choosing a name and sharing your name with others is a way of forging your identity and defining how others see you. But the High Evolutionary will only ever see his creations as living data, numbers to be thrown around. He has divided life forms into two categories, life that matters and life that doesn't. Any life he creates is his to dispose of, and in his eyes, a lower life form. Now later in the movie, we see Rocket parroting this idea when he says, we're all going to go save the higher life forms. And this is where the ideas about names, empathy, and reconciling trauma all come together. Rocket opens the movie singing along to the song Creep. The lyrics are about a singer who essentially hates himself, who says, I want a perfect body, I want a perfect soul. Rocket believes that he is imperfect and unlovable because his parent, the High Evolutionary, told him he was imperfect and unlovable. All through the movie, people misname Rocket as a badger and a squirrel, and every time somebody calls him a raccoon, he corrects them. But then there's a moment when they've evacuated the higher life forms, and then Rocket sees the cages filled with animals. He remembers his time with Lila, Teefs, and Floor, and suddenly he empathizes with the raccoon kids. He goes back for them because he sees a piece of himself inside of them, and vice versa. This is the moment he truly stops running from his past trauma and confronts it. And then we see the sign that says what he is, a raccoon. Afterwards, he makes his past part of his identity, his name, by finally calling himself Rocket Raccoon. And God, did I cry like a little baby who dropped the lollipop in the dirt, can never have it, unsalvageable, deep, deep cry. Now, James Gunn has said in a Facebook post that animals are very important to him, and the final act of this movie shows this, with scores of animals being rescued by the heroes. And these animals were only ever in danger because the High Evolutionary only saw them as a means to an end. And in the big action scenes like the hallway fight and versus the High Evolutionary, the Guardians only succeeded because they worked together, because empathy was their secret weapon. Meanwhile, the High Evolutionary kills everybody who works for him. Now, this is his expression of solipsism, or the idea that he is the only being in the universe that is real or that matters. And actually, I guess solipsism is kind of the opposite of empathy, because his actions isolate himself and he dies alone and afraid. And this is because the High Evolutionary believed that he, and he alone, could fix the universe and make it perfect. And if you want to make something perfect, you're inherently saying that it's imperfect and needs fixing. This is a rejection of empathy, because the High Evolutionary cannot accept people for who they are, only what he wants them to be. And he tells Rocket this directly, translating song lyrics from an opera, "Be not as you are, but as you should be." He tells Rocket that it is their sacred mission to take a cacophony of sounds and shape them into order and to music. And that's essentially what music is. It's sounds that are tuned together to create something harmonious. This harmony is a metaphor for the High Evolutionary's perfect society. The High Evolutionary's stated goal is to create a utopia.
Ah, yes, a place where all the letter U's can go to get some space from those darn O's.
No, actually, Doug, the term was coined by Sir Thomas More for his 1516 book Utopia, describing a fictional island society and a new world. This island society would be a perfect society, isolated from the ills of the rest of planet Earth, and a place where everybody worked in harmony. It's also a complete fiction and not remotely possible.
That wasn't real.
The word utopia even translates from the Greek into no place. So utopia literally means non-existent society. Now, had it been spelled with an EU, like the word euphoria, it would have meant good place.
You're in the good place.
But that's not how we spell it, so utopians are, by definition, chasing a fiction.
This is the bad place!
And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 does a brilliant job of spelling out why a utopia can never exist. Professor Lyman Tower Sargent argues that the utopian ideal is inherently contradictory because people are not homogenous. We're all a little bit different from each other. And the more of us there are, the more we will disagree. And as a society, we can't even agree on the color of this dress. Ironically, for everyone to get along, we don't need to agree on the color of the dress. We just need to accept that other people see it differently from ourselves. In other words, we have to have empathy with each other. But the High Evolutionary does not want a world with empathy. He wants a world of order. And the movie shows him trying to create this world on Counter-Earth. It's also so appropriate that his perfect world is modeled after a suburban household in the 1980s. The suburbs are areas outside of cities. They're usually planned communities aimed at people who are tired of living city life and want more space and safer streets. In the 1950s, middle-class and upper-middle-class families fled the cities to move into these new communities, which promised ant-like conformity at a price you could afford. The 1950s were an era where conformity became a commercial product. Products were advertised as this amazing thing that everyone else is using, so you don't want to get left out. This era also saw the rise of the nuclear family, this idea of the perfect American home that was exemplified on sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver or Ozzie and Harriet. In post-war America, it seemed like a better tomorrow was assured, and we were slowly moving toward a utopia. But of course, this was a lie.
You sit on a throne of lies.
Many of these artificial suburban communities excluded African Americans and other minorities, and moving to these communities was a way of ignoring society's problems rather than fixing them. And even in the High Evolutionary's perfect suburbs, individualism finds a way to shine through. Genetically, these people should be docile, but their environment changed them. Some people become drug addicts or gangsters. This scene where we see the imperfect society is set to Alice Cooper's song, I'm Always Chasing Rainbows. The song is about always striving for happiness at the end of a rainbow, but since you can never actually reach the end of a rainbow, happiness is unachievable. Unachievable, just like the High Evolutionary's utopia. And the counterpoint to this song is actually the doppelganger over at the end of the movie, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. You see, nowhere is a society that celebrates people's differences and everybody can live in harmony. But the High Evolutionary tries to accomplish his harmonious society through eugenics. Eugenics? It's weird hearing you say that word. Eugenics was invented by a piece of shit named Francis Galton. Now, Galton invented the idea of social Darwinism. So Darwinism is the observed scientific principle that life slowly evolves over millions of years to adapt to a particular set of circumstances. Social Darwinism is the made-up belief that certain races of people are more suited to survive than others. Unfortunately, this idea went mainstream in the early 20th century. In 1907, Indiana passed a law allowing for the forced sterilization of people with disabilities. And And the vast majority of these people were women who were overwhelmingly poor, minorities, or immigrants. In 1927, the Supreme Court said that the state of Virginia could sterilize a woman who was, quote, feeble-minded. It is estimated that between 60 and 70,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States during the 20th century.
Yeah, that's messed up.
Yes, and it wasn't just the crazies. Winston Churchill was a member of the British Eugenics Society, and this whole idea was seized by Hitler and the Nazi Party, who believed that a German utopia was achievable through perfected genetics, which they tried to achieve through torture and genocide, just like the High Evolutionary, who created rocket through torture and then routinely commits genocide against his creations, whereas he viewed himself as the Ubermensch.
What's the Ubermensch?
Again, weird to hear you say that. The philosopher Nietzsche conceived of this imaginary person, the Ubermensch, as somebody who was the ultimate man, somebody who was beyond notions of good and evil. In other words, an asshole.
A bunch of a-holes.
So all of these learned doctors and philosophers conceived of us as somebody who was the ancients, whereas he viewed himself as the Ubermensch.
What's the Ubermensch?
Again, weird to hear you say that. The philosopher Nietzsche conceived of this imaginary person, the Ubermensch, as somebody who was the ultimate man, somebody who was beyond notions of good and evil. In other words, an asshole.
A bunch of a-holes.
So all of these learned doctors and philosophers conceived of a system that relied on the perfect man, the perfect genes, the perfect society. And this is a lie because perfection does not exist. And I learned that by watching the 1991 sitcom The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Now this groundbreaking Nickelodeon show, which for some reason is not on streaming anywhere, featured an episode called Inspector 34, where the titular inspector comes to town and shows the people how to live a life of perfection. Little Pete gets caught up in this, enforcing draconian perfection onto the entire town. But then Inspector 34 eats barbecue chicken without getting messy, and everybody realizes that he missed the point.
You're supposed to use your hands.
It just tastes better that way.
So, bring that back to the High Evolutionary. By trying to accelerate through millions of years of evolution, he misses the point of evolution. Evolution is essentially a collection of mistakes that we have learned from. Like Master Yoda says,
The greatest teacher, failure is.
there can be no evolution without mistakes, without trial and error. So a species with accelerated evolution could never be perfect. We are shaped by our imperfections. Adam makes the mistake of killing a guy, but that mistake makes him want to be a better person. And this causes Adam to care for Blurp because he feels bad for destroying his master. In other words, Warlock feels empathy for Blurp. See, Blurp is the kind of creature that the High Evolutionary would rather see destroyed because it serves no functional purpose. Aisha even tells Adam to kill it, saying it doesn't belong here. But Adam keeps Blurp because he instinctively realizes that not everything needs a purpose. Sometimes people and pets just make you feel good.
Because I didn't understand why people care so much about their dumb dogs. Until I got a dumb dog myself.
Yeah, like how you make me feel good.
Exactly like that. But the High Evolutionary cannot just accept people for who they are, only for what they are not. Or, as Rocket says,
He didn't want to make things perfect. He just hated things the way they are.
Now, the High Evolutionary was the perfect villain for the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Obviously, there's a personal connection to Rocket's past, which has been teased since the first movie.
Why didn't it have to get made?
But more importantly, the High Evolutionary has this idea that the perfect society is achievable through the perfect race of people. And the Guardians have always been about showing the beauty in imperfections. They're all outcasts and weirdos who will never fit into normal society. And yet, they're the ones who can save the universe again and again. So the conflict at the end of Volume 3 is as much ideological as it is physical. And this reminds me of another science fiction movie about evolution and control. 2001, A Space Odyssey. Gunn packs a few different references to 2001 in this film. He confirmed that the spacesuits are modeled from the suits in 2001. The hamster wheel that Philo runs on is similar to the famous space station jog from that film. And there's also like the red security lights of the orgoscope, like when they deactivate HAL 9000.
Hey, I'm confused. I never saw that movie. What's it about?
Well, the film is essentially about the evolution of the human race. It begins at the dawn of man, when apes are inspired by a giant obelisk to begin using tools. Another obelisk sends humans to Jupiter, where the ship's computer, HAL 9000, kills the crew because it believes that the humans are a danger to the mission. And HAL 9000 also kills the humans because he believes that he is superior and more capable of completing their goals. However, HAL 9000 would never be able to complete their mission because he is merely a tool. He's just a more elaborate bone to be used by the human race. The reason the obelisk drew humans to Jupiter was to send them into a wormhole that would connect them to this alien race. And this race helps humanity evolve to the next step in their evolution, a giant space baby. Now, in this scenario, the High Evolutionary is HAL 9000, someone who believes that there is a very specific, ordered way to progress forward. But in reality, only a human being, a messy, wet, mistake-making sack of water that smiles, could evolve into a space baby simply because human beings are flawed. In David's vision, he becomes old, he breaks a glass, he's flawed and makes mistakes, but these mistakes are what make him imperfect and thus capable of improvement and change. You see, the high evolutionary's quest for perfection is actually a quest for control. He wants the universe to obey his laws and to be subservient to what he thinks is the right way to exist. A perfect universe is a subservient universe that is grateful to him. This is why he hates Rocket so much. Rocket is a genius, even smarter than the high evolutionary, but the high evolutionary doesn't understand how his creation could surpass him. As he tells him, he was never meant for the new world. He is imperfect and unlovable. Even when Rocket is fixing his machines, the high evolutionary gets annoyed at his improper grammar, correcting how he says can't to can't. Like that time Sean made fun of me for pronouncing the word cement as cement. Yeah, Sean, I remember that, and now all the people watching this also think that you're a jerk.
Yeah, you suck, Sean.
High five. You see, the high evolutionary hates Rocket because the raccoon reminds him of his own imperfections. He sees Rocket as fundamentally flawed, but his grammar is terrible, so he can't understand why such a flawed creature was able to surpass him. And he also can never understand why Rocket is so intelligent. So this means that the high evolutionary, as his creator, has a flaw. So Rocket is a constant reminder of his creator's imperfections. And after the raccoon tears apart his face, Rocket becomes a reminder of his physical imperfection as well. So rather than just accept Rocket for who he is and learn from him, his solution is to cut him open and study his organs. As John Craigie would sing, dissecting the bird to get to the song. But the movie implies that there's another connection between Rocket and those early humans of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Both of them are able to evolve because they have a divine spark within them. In 2001, this divine spark was formed by the alien beings who sent the obelisk to Earth. But in Guardians 3, that divine spark comes from God.
It was God!
That's right. James Gunn has made the most religious movie in the MCU, and this franchise features 4 movies with a god as the lead character, plus the Loki series.
Yeah, are you sure this seems like a reach?
It is not a reach. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Gunn said, "I was raised Catholic, and I still pray sometimes, but I don't really identify with any particular religion. I believe in a higher power, but I don't know what that higher power is. I think it's something that's beyond our understanding." And that fits right in with how God is depicted in this movie. In the first scene of this movie, the hand of a scientist, or the hand of God, reaches out toward the raccoons. All the animals shy away except for Rocket. Something about him is special. Call it intellectual curiosity, or say that he was chosen by a divine force that sits above the high evolutionary. When Lila meets Rocket in the afterlife, Rocket tells her they made us for nothing, stupid experiments to be thrown away. And then she answers, there are the hands that made us, and then there are the hands that made the hands. Basically telling him that there is a higher power at play, and that he has been chosen by that power to do good in the world. And this divine spark is why Rocket is the only creation of the high evolutionaries who, in his words, knows true invention. This scene with Lila shows us the movie's real conflict is between a force that guides the universe, or God, if you will, fighting to stop a false god, the high evolutionary. This higher power can give Rocket that intellectual spark that the high evolutionary can never understand. As the high evolutionary says, a populace unable to think what has not already been thought will die on the vine. So, as a creator, the high evolutionary will never be as powerful as, like, the god, the original creator of everything. Even though, look, this guy has one hell of a god complex. Before we even see him, Gamora says that entire worlds worship him as a god. On Counter-Earth, there's a statue of him, and a baby even has like a knitted doll made in his image. There's little touches throughout the movie, like how his underlings bring him a box to appear taller than Aisha. He wants her to look up at him in fear and wonder, like he's a god. When really, Rocket is much smaller and a lot more intelligent. The high evolutionary doesn't seem to believe in intelligent design. He believes that the world was chaotic, unguided. This belief is called deism. It's the idea that God created the world, but then left to go create something else, and then everything's kind of fallen into place since then. Several founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, were deists. So the high evolutionary believes that he is the new intelligent designer of the universe. His ridicule of the old gods is apparent when he screams, "Fire everything we have at that dead God." He even says at one point, "There is no God, that's why I stepped in." So it's hard to hear this and not think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This was the very first science fiction novel, and it's about a scientist trying to replicate the work of God, to create life. And that's exactly who the high evolutionary is. Dr. Frankenstein's creation is a product of science, but it's also a violation of nature. The monster's existence disrupts the natural order of things, and it only leads to violence and destruction. Just like how the high evolutionary's actions lead to destruction and suffering because of his quest to replace the spiritual with with the scientific. And also, the movie contains like so many biblical allegories. So let's start with the book of Genesis. The High Evolutionary is obsessed with creating an Eden, a paradise, but his creations always ruin this paradise with their individuality. This is just like the biblical Garden of Eden. God created a paradise for Adam and Eve, but when they ate from the tree of knowledge, they could never return. So I've always thought that the garden wasn't literal. It's a metaphor for growing up. We reach a certain age, we realize we're naked, we wear clothes, we learn about the world, and then we forever lose the idyllic paradise that childhood gave us. And this is basically what happens to Rocket when he eats from the tree of knowledge. He gets smarter, he spends more time at the High Evolutionary, then he learns that they're all going to be killed, and then his friends are murdered. He is forever banished from the childhood Garden of Eden, and he can never return to the happy days when he danced with his friends. There's also a couple of literal nods to Genesis in the movie.
I can feel it calling in the air tonight.
Actually, Doug, that was from Phil Collins' solo work, not from Genesis. That hand that reaches for Rocket and Adam Warlock saving Peter are both framed as the moment God gave life to Adam, as depicted in the Sistine Chapel. But, as we learned in Westworld, Michelangelo actually concealed God inside of a brick to imply that our consciousness was actually derived from our intelligence. The God of Genesis was also similar to the High Evolutionary in that he was very vengeful and violent. He destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, just like how the High Evolutionary destroyed Counter-Earth. He even tells Aisha, "It's my right as your maker to destroy you." And God also destroyed the entire world with a flood, sparing only the people and animals that were on Noah's Ark. And the High Evolutionary's pyramid is filled with the life forms that he deems worth saving, just like the Ark. And speaking of his pyramid, pyramids are always used as a symbol of the divine. The dollar bill has a pyramid with an eye at the top, a symbol of the Eye of Providence or the Eye of God. Pharaohs were considered to be living gods, and they were laid to rest in pyramids until the day they were to be resurrected. But they were also false gods who rotted in their pyramids, just like another false god, the High Evolutionary, who likely died alone in his pyramid. And the final battle of the movie is people inside of a dead god fighting a false god. It doesn't really get more biblical than that. The Bible is filled with stories of the tribes of Israel taking on the worshippers of false gods, destroying shrines to Baal, conquering the Philistines. But also, the movie doesn't just include nods to Western religion. To use the arrow, Kraglin has to achieve a kind of meditative state to find nirvana. This sense of balance is much more in line with Eastern religions, in particular Buddhism and Hinduism. This is also the final moment when Kraglin is able to reconcile his own trauma, the guilt of betraying his mentor Yondu. He finally sees himself as a worthy successor, and he can finally aim true. And this is really the journey of every Guardian in this movie, finally healing from their past traumas, moving past their problems, and then they're able to make the universe a better place. Nebula decides that she's going to fix Thanos' mistakes instead of dwelling on them. She's going to raise the children to give them the life that she never had. Also, she spent her entire life destroying civilizations, and now she can finally build one. And now that she's no longer looking inward, she's able to look outward and help other people find their purpose. She sees that Drax's true calling is to be a father figure to the kids and not to be a destroyer. Remember, Drax became a destroyer to avenge his family's deaths.
Ronan murdered my wife, Obed. And my daughter can marry you.
And now he can put the life of death and destruction behind him and focus on raising a new life. And of course, Peter returns to Earth. The series began with him leaving, and he's constantly talked about how much Earth sucks.
Earth? Earth is the place where my mother died in front of me. I'm half human, so that 50% of me that's stupid, that's 100% you.
You see, Peter's emotional growth was stunted when he was taken away in 1989. So in many ways, he's still stuck in that same era. All of his references are from that time period.
There's a legend about people like you. It's called Footloose.
Hell, he even kept a Panthro action figure in his backpack, which is actually a cool nod to the Ani-Men that we didn't include in our Easter egg breakdown. And then for decades, Peter couldn't bring himself to even open up his mother's final present to him. So in many ways, Peter, like our pop, which is actually a cool nod to the Ani-Men that we didn't include in our Easter egg breakdown. And then for decades, Peter couldn't bring himself to even open up his mother's final present to him. So in many ways, Peter, like our pop culture, is kind of cemented in the 1980s. And this was symbolized by Counter-Earth also being frozen in this decade. See, this was a perfect idyllic time in Peter's life, his childhood, his Garden of Eden. So the High Evolutionary symbolically also used this era to be his Garden of Eden. Its destruction is a literal reminder to Peter that this perfect world only existed in his mind, and now he can go back home to confront his past. It's also extremely sweet that his grandfather knew Peter on sight. And of course, the movie is bookended with the Zune playing music over the speakers on Nowhere. In the first scene, Rocket is alone, dwelling on his imperfect body, focused on himself. But in the last scene, he is dancing to the song The Dog Days Are Over, a song that's about a woman who is trying to deny herself happiness, but happiness finds her anyways. Just like for the Guardians, they've told themselves a lie for years. The lie that they are ugly, that they're imperfect, the lie that they're unlovable. But after they see the world through one another's eyes, they understand how wonderful and lucky they really are to have found each other. The song is about seeing a light at the end of the tunnel and knowing that even when things are at their lowest, someday the dog days will be over and those bad times will only be in the past. The final dance is the ultimate celebration of survival, empathy, and love. So I just want to thank the entire crew who's worked on this video and all the Guardians of the Galaxy videos we've been doing. Keep it subscribed right here to Screen Crush and let me know your thoughts down in the movies below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.
So hold up.
One track.
We're all a little wild. Jump in, embrace it. I have the honor to present David Zaslav for Boston University's honorary degree.
Hey, welcome back to Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy. Right now, there is a threat to the Marvel Cinematic Universe that's greater than Kang, bigger than Galactus, something that's even more dangerous to the MCU than James Gunn's DCU. And that is the ongoing conflict between the movie studios and the writers who create our most beloved stories. On May 2nd, 2023, the Writers Guild of America put their pencils and keyboards away, opting to go on strike for the 6th time since its founding in 1954. And this one event is going to be the #1 force that shapes Marvel and Star Wars for years to come.
So who in the right there?
The Writers Guild of America. They're the Hollywood labor union that represents professional film, television, radio, and comedy writers across the country. Some of our favorite fandom writers like Michael Waldron, Jeff Loveness, Jessica Yao, Jack Schaefer, and even Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni are all members of the WGA.
Oh, don't get me started. I'm mad about the whole thing. Because some shows and movies I was all pumped about, like Blade and Daredevil and Andor Season 2, and they all paused production because of those writers. Now I gotta wait even longer for those titles to be released.
Well, hold on there, buddy. I would actually frame this in a much different way.
Like how?
Well, what if I told you that it's not like the writers want to be on strike?
Do you know that? It's important to me that you know that.
Then you would have my attention as I prepare to have my little point of view changed.
Chances are that over the past few weeks, fans have either seen online or heard in the news that many of their favorite television shows or films have been halted mid-filming. And also, all the late-night shows are down. Saturday Night Live is down. The list is very long, and it grows larger and larger each day. And it might stay that way until a fair contract deal between the WGA and the AMPTP is reached, meaning that many of our favorite shows and films might have their release dates pushed back.
Wait, the who again?
Okay, the AMPTP is the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. It's an organization of suits that represent major film and television studios during labor negotiations with all the major Hollywood unions. When contracts are up, the AMPTP negotiates on behalf of studios like Walt Disney, Warner Brothers, Universal, Sony, Paramount, Amazon, and others. They are responsible for reaching collective bargaining agreements with these unions on issues such as compensation, working conditions, and benefits.
So they're the people the writers told their demands to for their new contracts?
Correct.
Oh, so how'd it go?
Not good, Doug. Not good at all.
Not great, Bob.
Well, what did the writers ask for?
Luckily, the WGA has been very clear and concise on their demands, even sending out a list of the Guild's official asks and the response from the AMPTP. Overall, writers are asking for around $430 million per year to address major issues within the profession, such as writers' room sizes, residual payments on projects, paid development for features, and even the usage of AI in scripts.
Were you expecting a man?
Yeah, why would I expect a giant AI brain and not a man?
Ooh, that's a lot of money. How much did the AMPTP counter with?
86.
$86? Wow, that's so much.
No. The AMPTP shot back at the WGA with a depressing $86 million counteroffer. When WGA members wanted to see what the AMPTP had to say about these major changes, all they were given was a short sentence that has now been made famous throughout the guild. Rejected our proposal, refused to make a counter.
Well, that doesn't seem fair.
No, it doesn't, especially if you think about the profession as a whole. Writers are literally the backbone and nervous system of the entertainment industry. They write and create the content that you see on screen. Any kind of monetary profit that a studio receives from a film or TV show is because they had somebody writing a product that the public enjoyed. In the past, a majority of these profits would go to the writers themselves, helping them sustain day-to-day life while they searched for their next job. Later in the episode, I'm actually going to be joined by WGA writer Adam Lloyd to help us understand everything that's going down in Tinseltown. Now, with streaming as the main method of consuming film and television, a majority of these profits are now stuffing the pockets of executives and shareholders who had very little to do with the actual products being made.
And there are executive producer credits of people who do absolutely nothing on this show. Is that correct? Nothing.
Now, much has changed since the last strike in 2007. Streaming is now a global enterprise that has gotten away with basically turning the profession of screenwriting into a gig industry. In the year 2000, the major studios reported $5 billion in operating profits. Now, to give you a comparison, in the 2020s, these profits were well around $30 billion, all thanks to the massive amount of streaming content being produced. See, what's happened is streaming sites are treated as new media, so the normal constraints of network and cable television don't quite apply to streaming. So these streaming networks like Netflix and Amazon have been using what's called micro rooms, where instead of employing a large writer's room of people of 10 or more writers, these rooms just have 2 or 3 writers who are basically given no job security, and they are being treated as disposable. You see, being part of a union should help ensure that you aren't being treated as a gig professional. Gig professionals meaning somebody who is only hopping from gig to gig. Now, I'm not hating gig to gig jobs, I did those for years, but these writers have fought tooth and nail just to get into the WGA. The WGA is considered one of the hardest unions to join, but the industry has gotten so big and so profitable that many TV writers who break the WGA starting at the staff writer level are forced to repeat that level again due to shows or miniseries not getting a second season, or in some cases not even going into production or release at all.
Or like that Batgirl movie written by Christina Hodson. It's all shot and ready to go until the studio decided
To take a massive tax cut by not even releasing the movie to the public, all to save a few dollars. When you have dozens of streaming platforms creating hundreds of shows and films just to throw them out after one season, it keeps some writers stuck in those levels, not paving a pathway for a thriving career. This process causes the middle class of Hollywood writers to another ad. Fudge.
Bro, he wasn't even finished talking.
If there's no middle class of writers, there's only the lowest level and the highest level. And without the experienced writers in the middle to help beef up storytelling, the recipe for disaster, which is probably why one of the WGA demands was a minimum staff size on every television project. They did this in the hopes of getting more people, more jobs, and creating an actual functioning hierarchy of positions that can sustain the profession as a whole and make product and content better.
But what about movies? Let's say a movie's finished filming. Why would the writer's strike affect the release date?
Great question. So these days, after a film has completed shooting, that doesn't mean the project is finished. The cast and crew might be called back for a series of reshoots, which involves writers either rewriting scenes that may not have worked in the initial shoot, or to add scenes and moments that the studio might want the audiences to see in order to make sense later down the line in a different project. Our friends at Marvel are notorious for these reshoots, all due to the constant changing business model and what stories are released when.
Oh, okay, so you need those writers for those reshoots.
Exactly. Now, in the past, the WGA has held strong and for the most part has succeeded in reaching a fair deal with the AMPTP. The 2007 strike was mainly focused on healthcare and pension, and it lasted for 100 days. You might remember television shows like Heroes, Lost, Smallville, Breaking Bad, How I Met Your Mother, and 30 Rock, and many others all having shortened seasons with questionable plot lines, all due to both the rushing to halt and restart filming. So that's a little bit of background, but now I'm very lucky to be joined by Everything's Trash writer Adam Lloyd, and Adam is like fresh off the picket lines. He's a WGA writer on strike, and I've got so many questions for you, Adam, about how this is going to work and how you see it ending, and what exactly are you striking for? How you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to talk all things strike with you and get some good information out there.
Yeah, well, we need it because, to us people who are not really, who are just slightly outside the business or not even involved in the business, it all seems very confusing. So a lot of what we're seeing here seems centered around writers' rooms and TV writers. Can you explain, what a writer's room is and how a season of television is actually created by you guys?
So, Writer's Room is basically a group of people who are writers who've been hired by a studio to basically come up with the stories and write each episode of a season of television. Every single writer's room has someone who's called a showrunner, and it's usually one person or two persons, and they can be pretty much, every single writer's room has someone who's called a showrunner, and it's usually one person or two persons, and they can be pretty much considered the head writer of that show. And I think the best way it was described to me is the showrunner is like a painter, and all of the writers in the room are the paint. And so it's up to us to just kind of paint the showrunner's vision of what they want their show to be. So basically, we take some time to talk about what we want the show to be, and then we outline episodes, and the showrunner assigns different scripts to different writers. They go off and write their episode. They come back to the room, and then every writer kind of gets their chance to throw in their color of paint into the script just to make it kind of better. And then voila, you have a whole episode of television right there. And then production.
So, yeah, and I've seen behind the scenes of Rick and Morty. I've seen the writers' rooms on there. And I've seen, like, the She-Hulk, where it goes behind the scenes. We see the writer's room. It's always, like, a really big group of people who look like they're either having a great time or they're totally miserable. But we're also hearing a lot about micro rooms.
Yes.
Like, what are those, and, like, what kind of show is using a micro room?
So, a mini room would...
Mini room, sorry.
Mini room is, they're awful. And basically what it is a group, it's the same thing as a writer's room, but they might be tasked to break a whole show in a very specific amount of time. So it may be, instead of like the 10 to 20 weeks that a normal room is given, they're given like 4 weeks. And it's not necessarily to say that all of those writers will be writing an episode. They're just coming up with the storylines for those showrunners. And it might then be tasked to like a showrunner, or it might be a couple higher level writers to then write the entire show based off of all the information that came from that mini room. And when you're in a mini room, you're probably going to be paid as minimally as possible according to the WGA minimums, because you're just not there for that long, and there may not be that many of you in the room as well. I think the main point of mini rooms is to just treat them as real rooms, is basically what we're fighting for, because it's just another way to cut off profits to the writers. It's another way to just keep people at lower levels in the writer's room in general. And with these new caveats that the WGA is carving out for these, it's basically just taking a mini room and making it a regular writer's room, which is what they already are.
Earlier I talked about, the Marvel stuff that's going on, like Daredevil Born Again and different movies that are shooting, and how, like, production is shutting down, in part because of picketers outside, because union people won't cross union lines. But also, when the script's written, isn't it just written? Why are writers still needed? I thought writers, like, were the least valuable people on set.
Yeah, that's... Well, you never see the writers at the award shows. They're always shoved in the back, so don't look at them. But it's not true. You see, writers are on set because they have written that episode, and they know exactly the messaging behind every word that is supposed to be coming out of the actor's mouths. So, a writer, being on set is actually acting as a producer in a way to make sure that everything's flowing in the way the show is supposed to flow. We're also on set looking for like continuity errors to make sure that everything will line up later in post-production. And there might just be inside information that the writer has as to where the show is going to be, like weeks from when they're shooting their show.
Right, of course. Especially a serialized show like Star Trek Picard or Marvel shows. Yeah,
of course. Even look at The Mandalorian. They probably knew where they were going, and then just wanted to make sure that nothing in episode or chapter 7 would make sense later down the road in chapter 14 or something like that.
And of course, Marvel is notorious for thinking things up on the fly, cutting a version of the movie together, going, that doesn't really work, and then going back for reshoots. And if those reshoots are so baked in, like Ant-Man and the Wasp reshot their ending like a few weeks before the movie came out. So obviously, if you don't have a writer on set, that's going to delay the production, or we're just going to end up with whatever the original version of that would have been. Can I just, real quick, I'm not trying, this is not an insult or anything. I'm picturing you live in Hollywood, I'm on the East Coast with all the real people. But you're in Hollywood in your mansion, in your writer's mansion with your pool and everything. I went on the WGA website and I saw that like a median income is like $70,000 a year for WGA members. At least that's what they say. That doesn't seem bad to me. I mean, you know, you're not going to necessarily break the bank or buy a boat with that, but like, is that number accurate? I'm not asking how much money you make a year. I just want to know, like, what is it you're fighting for here?
No, that's, again, is another great question. And I agree with you. Around $70,000 for a year of work does sound pretty great. But when you're talking to an artist and when you're talking to a person who is, you know, creating something, you kind of have to take in different caveats, because you're given a lump sum as this is what you're going to be paid, but then you have to take out 10% of that for your manager. You have to take out 5% of that for your lawyer, another 10% out of that for your agent. So that's 25% of your entire income gone automatically.
Wow.
And then you're paid
before taxes.
Before taxes. And
oh my God.
Then you have to pay your WGA dues, your union dues. You've got to put stuff into your health insurance and all that stuff. Excuse me. So, and especially if we want to get into the nitty gritty about it, if you're a staff writer, the lowest level of writers, which I was on my show, you're not given what's called a script fee. And a script fee is literally a large amount of money that's given to a writer to basically say, we're paying you for this script, thank you. And those are what basically help writers sustain their lives from job to job while they're looking for other work. But it's been years and years of this practice that script fees will not be given to staff writers, because they've looked at staff writers as the lowest rung on the ladder, so it might be like, oh, they need a lot more help in producing their episode. And nowadays, that's not really true. And you're kind of around $25,000 away from people who might necessarily need it. And
yeah, I just did some quick math, and it looks like before taxes, after all those fees, not even counting WGA fees, it's $57,000 a year, and then roughly 2/3 the taxes, and also you have to pay for your own health insurance or commitments to your union, so that's where your dues go. I understand why that's a problem, especially with rent in LA. And then what you're talking about with like these getting just script by script work, I come from video production. That's just like gig work, right? Like what we talked about earlier. Like you're just basically living to gig to get by.
Yeah.
So what is this? How would the strike benefit this then? Like what is it you guys are picketing for that would change that system?
Well, I mean, there are tons of bullet points that we're striking for that will help that entire system. And one of them that I love is staffing size minimums in a room. And that basically is saying that we're going to have a set number of writers for any type of show. You have to have this many in this position, this many in that position, blah, 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 and so on. There's also, weekly increases to payment. There is the deal of script fees for staff writers in there as well. But the main point, Ryan, is risiduals. And risiduals and streaming. And, it used to be back in the day where, if you were on a network show, you would then go have that episode aired again and again on television. That is you getting a residual check. You getting
right, like the Seinfeld episode where he gets 2 cents every time this Japanese show gets credit to stand up. So a residual is basically like a royalty every time it goes on. You get a little bit of paid good commercials. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and and you have to remember that those streaming residual numbers were negotiated in a time where streaming wasn't as big as it is right now. Streaming is a global enterprise. That's where we are. And so now you have people and writers going from getting paid a substantial amount of, for their work to now honestly receiving pennies on the dollar for all of their stuff. And it not just affects television writers, it also affects feature film writers as well. Because, you look behind you, you have all these DVDs and videos up there, and a percentage of those sales went to the writers who wrote them. Well, now, you don't really have a lot of people buying physical media. So they're not getting those residuals from DVDs or Blu-rays or anything like that. So when you see all these people going to like Hulu or Netflix to watch films, a lot of those writers are missing out on those residuals that would have went to them if they were to buy a physical copy.
Can I ask, so you might see a system here in place where I write a movie for Netflix, it goes up, and every time Netflix, somebody watches that movie on Netflix, Ryan gets a penny or whatever the price is. Does Netflix even release these numbers?
No.
To the writers, or is it kept a secret? The numbers of people who are watching the movie.
Correct. No, not at all. And it's not just Netflix.
Oh.
Yeah, no. That is actually one of the biggest problems, is that we do not see these numbers. We don't see who's watching the most of what. And it's basically just like on this trust system within these giant streaming conglomerates that what they're telling us is correct. And I think it was Danny Strong who was in an interview saying it kind of seems a little bit illegal to not let us see how well a certain product is doing, especially if a studio or a network or a production company is putting millions of dollars behind something. They can't compare toward the data that they need to see if it's actually a successful product or not.
Yeah, especially as a company's publicly held.
Correct.
On the New York Stock Exchange, you have to disclose basically everything.
Yeah.
To your shareholders. It's just to again play devil's advocate. This I might sound a little offensive here. We are currently in a golden age of TV, of peak TV. We're all these different oh my god, have you seen Silo? Silo's amazing. Apple is one of these streaming services that is so under the radar consistently. Foundation, all this stuff, right? But is the reason these networks are able to do so much, not network streaming services, they're able to do so much, is because they've been underpaying writers like you. And if that's the case, does that mean that if you make a fair wage, are we going to see a lot less? And do you think that will that age of golden TV end?
Not at all.
I'm saying, are you sure you don't want to work for slave wages so I can watch Silo and Apple Plus? That's what I'm saying.
Weird, yeah. I think actually you kind of condensed the strike into one question. It's kind of basically, and this is just me and my personal opinion, the whole strike is basically centered around the future of screenwriting in general. We're fighting to keep it a profession, a career within ourselves and in this art that is storytelling. There is so much money in this town, Ryan, and in this industry that you would think that it's not that big of an ask. As you might have said in the video, we're asking for $430 million.
Yeah, it seems like a big number.
It does. It really does seem like a big number. But when you look at the income of all of these studios being in the billions and in to the 50 billion, 30 billion, excuse me, in operating profits, it's only 3%, if that, to something.
Oh wow, to the people who originate the content, without the writer.
Yeah, you have
bad improv, yeah.
Right, exactly. If you don't have a writer, you don't have content. And let me be the first to say that, not the first to say that every single writer is ready to go back to work. We are ready, willing, and able to get back in there and start creating tons of new awesome content. Because I think you are right. This is the golden age of television, and we are in a time where, basically we can do anything that we want. It's just that we need to be trusted by the people who are hiring us to do that. And if they want us to do that, they need to pay us fairly because of it.
Yeah, and another thing too, and I've seen this in my industry as well, is the advent of AI. I'm watching YouTube videos about how an AI can write your YouTube Easter egg breakdown. Eric Voss did a video on Deep Dive where he actually invented an Eric Voss AI. so he would finally have a friend. No, he did it. It was an interesting experiment to see, like, if an AI could take his place. He's gonna kill me. Okay, so the question then is, like, I've tried this stuff out. It doesn't seem like an AI can write an Easter egg video. How is an AI gonna write a movie, and why is that a threat to you?
Well, I mean, it's a threat to me because they're trying to take my job. And, in that whole discussion, you have to kind of break down what AI really is. And, like, I'm from the belief of, at this point in time, AI is not really so much of an artificial intelligence as it is just theft across the internet of words and an algorithm to put the best response out there. And even in the Eric Voss video, you could see that the AI was really giving him false information for that script that he wrote. And we see that across the board. And I have had this conversation with several other writers, and if we're going to talk about using AI, because we're going to have to, AI is not going anywhere, but that doesn't mean that it can't be compressed into some kind of a tool for writers that could help us along the way. But as something that might want to take my job completely, I have to disagree with that aspect of it all, because writers, all kinds of storytellers have this thing called human empathy, which allows us to create these stories in order to help people change their perspective on things, to give them feelings, to make them see a situation in a way that they've never seen before. And I really don't think a computer can do that. In fact, I think there's been several tweets and pictures and videos about ChatGPT or AI saying that AI would be better at a CEO's job than it would actually be at a writer's job itself. And maybe we should give that a try.
So for you, what to you is the most surprising?
Well, I'll be honest, it's a pleasant surprise. It's the solidarity. It's